Good morning, colleagues.
Morning.
We're still missing Councillor Coombs, but I'm mindful that we do have the Education, Children and Young People's Executive, which we should be starting around 10 o'clock or at the conclusion of this meeting. So I think we'll maybe make a start, and I'm sure that Councillor Coombs will join us in due course. I think everybody's present, but just to check, do we have any apologies?
No, there are no apologies submitted, Convener.
Thank you. Are there any declarations of interest? No. Okay, thank you, colleagues. This morning's is a single item agenda, and it's a motion that is referred to the Executive under Standing Order 331, and it was referred from the Council to the Executive, and it's in relation to the pension fund. It's a very long motion, therefore I'll ask if people want it read out or whether we want to take that as read.
As read.
As read. People content with that? Yep. Okay, and I will therefore move to Councillor Garner to as a proposer of the motion.
Thank you, Convener. And first of all, I'd like to thank Councillor Bissett and Councillor Kerr for allowing this agenda item to be taken when I was able to attend. So thanks very much for that. Yes, so you've all read the motion, I'm sure, and so I'll just talk a little bit to it. Falkirk Council area is not only one of Scotland's key strategic and economic assets, it is also one of the largest contributors to carbon emissions nationally. At Falkirk, we see ourselves as a key location to showcase how you can decarbonise at pace and scale, to take advantage of global sustainable growth successes such as the energy transition and the favourable economic shift toward companies which implement more sustainable practices. Falkirk Council are working hard to decarbonising and reducing their negative impact in our service delivery and those caused by our assets themselves. We will also take a strategic approach to helping these businesses, industries and communities within our area to make more sustainable choices and have a more positive impact on our collective journey to net zero. Given this context, it seems counterintuitive to then continue to place investment in companies whose services derive from fossil fuel exploitation. The Falkirk Council Pension Fund has one of the largest proportions of its fund in the UK directly associated with fossil fuel companies, well above the UK average. Whilst markets are certainly buoyant and fossil fuels are expected to be around for some time yet, it seems prudent that at very least, we ask and expect individuals to make sustainable choices in their everyday lives so that we take some outlook with their investments, allowing individuals who feel strongly about divestment an opportunity to direct how their money is invested and where the retirement provision will come without compromising their environmental impact. We always say it's for our kids and grandkids, and that is wholly true in relation to choices. Hopefully you could hear me there because my link was bouncing in and out. Hopefully this motion will be supported by all members. Happy to move the motion. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you, Councillor Garner. Yeah, certainly I could hear you okay, and nobody's indicated otherwise. So thank you for that. I think Councillor Bowes, you're going to second the motion?
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, the motion, got to thank Paul for bringing this forward. I think it's very important at this time. I know it mentions COP26, but to be honest, I think it's something we should be doing anyway, whether there was a COP26 meeting in Glasgow or not. And I'm going to keep it quite simple. I totally agree with what Paul's done. I think the work that he's done for it is superb, and I'm happy to second the motion.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Bowes. I will now open up for the debate and anyone that wishes to speak. Councillor Bissett.
Thanks, Convener. We have an amendment. I'll give notice of that. And so I'll just read out a wee statement about this. Falkirk Council is administrator of a £3 billion pension fund that involves about 30 different employers, including Falkirk Council, Stirling Council, Clipmartinshire Council, as well as SEPA and Forth Valley College. There's a total of 36,000 people in the pension fund, 6,000 active, 7,000 deferred and 13,000 pensioners. We cannot in all conscience ask the Pensions Committee to make a decision at this moment in time to divest from fossil fuels without discussion with the Pensions Committee and other employers to allow due consideration to this very complex matter and then bring forward a report to the Executive. As far as I'm aware, Councillor Gardner has not had any dialogue with the Pensions Committee, which is rather worrying given the enormity of the decision he's asking them to take. Climate emergency requires a just transition from the use of fossil fuels, and any action must be based on properly informed, balanced decisions that have no detriment to all stakeholders. We do not have properly informed decisions in front of us at this moment. So I'll read our amendment. In place of the motion, I would ask the Executive to agree, 1, that the climate emergency requires action on a just transition from the use of fossil fuels and the move towards net zero, but that any such action should be based on properly informed decisions. 2, that the Pensions Committee is not asked to make a decision prior to COP26, committing it to fossil fuel divestment with the intention of divesting completely as quickly as possible. 3, instead, the Pensions Committee is asked to give wider consideration to the question of divestment, including the extent to which divestment can take place without detriment to the interests of all stakeholders in the fund, and whether continuing to hold investments provides a platform to influence companies in the fossil fuel sector to move to a just transition. And 4, ask that any report setting out the consideration of these issues is reported back to the Executive following discussion at the Pensions Committee, recognising that this may be a substantial piece of work that comes after COP26. Formally move that, Convener.
Thank you, Councillor Bissett. Do you have a seconder?
Yes, I believe Councillor Coombs is going to second that.
Convener, just in the absence of Councillor Coombs, I'd be happy to second that on behalf of Councillor Bissett.
Councillor Coombs is with us, actually. Are you having difficulties with your sound, Councillor Coombs? Are you happy for Councillor Nimmo to formally second, and you'll have the opportunity to speak when we can sort things out?
Right, am I here yet?
Right, yes, we can hear you now. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Too many screens opened. Excuse me, sorry. Yeah, as our amendment says, this is too important to be rushed through. I think a headline is very well, but whilst I'm a committed environmentalist, I think it's far too simplistic to say that we divest our pension funds and this is going to have a meaningful impact on the carbon emissions that we make here. I think this needs to be looked at very carefully, and I absolutely agree that we need to have an analysis to investigate how much of this pension fund is invested in the fossil fuel industry. There is an urgent need to have an in-depth discussion about what companies are doing to move away from their reliance on oil and gas. And there's something tells me that this same sort of debate when I was in the Pensions Committee 8 years ago. However, an arbitrary deadline isn't what's required here. This is grown-up stuff and it should be looked at in detail. The balance of the portfolios and the risk profile of alternative investments must be taken into account. This is a discussion that should be had, as Councillor Bissett says, at the Pensions Committee, with the full knowledge of what investments are held and by whom, and what the alternative options might look like. without compromising the value of employees' pensions. I'm sure that all members in this council, and some of whom are receiving a pension at the moment, they would agree that consideration, excuse me, consideration to the return on investments should be, as well as consideration to the climate emergency. There is much more that this council and Holyrood should be doing to reduce carbon emissions. Rather than trying to rush this headline amendment, this headline motion through this committee as an emergency today. I live in Grangemouth, and as Councillor Gardner said, it's one of the biggest carbon emitting areas in Scotland. In fact, INEOS is the biggest carbon emitters. And whilst I appreciate the benefit that they bring to the area, I'm also very aware that Scottish Government are doing very little to control these emissions through legislation. We're paying lip service here, and the pensions fund isn't the big driver that we're making it out to be. And finally, I think it's ironic that the SNP who recently were telling the people of Scotland that oil was the golden ticket in the chocolate factory for the independence debate. It seems now that with the Green Alliance, the climate crisis, and the dramatic drop in the price of oil, that's turned that particular argument on its head, almost faster than you can turn an oil tanker. Happy to second the amendment, Convener.
Okay, thank you. And Jack is now going to share the amendment, and I will call a short recess to allow some consideration of the amendment once people have had the opportunity to read it.
Convener, have we been emailed this amendment? Because it is.
Yes, Jack's confirmed it's been emailed as well.
Thank you.
The Labour's position will be next week.
Okay, colleagues, if we can have a 15-minute recess to give consideration to the amendment and the implications of it.
Thank you, Convener. I'm not going to speak too long on this one, although it is an extremely important matter, but it's one we should be taking sooner rather than later, in my opinion. Councillor Bissett mentioned that I hadn't spoken directly to the Pensions Committee, and that is factually correct. But I had spoken to this Pensions Committee through our member of the Pension Committee board within our group, and I had spoken to Brian Smale at length, and we actually got him to speak directly to the full group. So we've not taken this decision lightly. We have looked into it in full, and I do take a bit of offence at what Councillor Bissett insinuated there. This amendment is yet again, and it's not for the first time, Labour failing to make a big decision. They come up with sound bites saying they're environmentalists, but this proves that to be just hot air, methane if you like. This is an emergency, and as such should be treated as that, not kicked into the long grass. We aren't supporting the amendment, we're sticking with the motion, and we think this decision should be taken here and taken by all members, hopefully. But we'll soon find out what the other group has got to say. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Councillor Garner. Just before I open it up further, I've got a couple of questions, a couple of comments. First, I wanted to ask Mr. Smale. I'm aware that there's a letter that is going to the Pensions Committee from Stirling Council along similar lines, and I don't know whether he's has the ability to maybe outline that to us. And just by way of explanation, this hasn't been rushed through. It's not been pushed through as an emergency. It was originally brought forward months ago, and the only reason it is here today at this particular meeting, following deferral from the previous executive, is that so it can go to the Pensions Committee, which is next week. And that's so I don't see that this is something that's been rushed through. But Mr. Smale, are you able to say anything about the letter from Stirling Council?
Yes, convener, and good morning. We have received a formal letter from Stirling Council, which flowed from a similar consideration to this by Stirling Council. It does make representations in terms of divestment. It's not linked directly or explicitly to COP26 in the way this motion is, but it does advocate a strategy of divestment. Maybe one element in that representation from Stirling, which reflects or is an indicator of the complexity of this matter. The request is not from divestment from or limited to just fossil fuel companies. The letter then supplements it by saying anything that's impacting on climate emergency. And that takes us into the realms of virtually everything that's done impacts haulage, transport, farming. You know, where would you draw the line? So there is an inherent complication with that particular representation, but it has of itself triggered a report which I'm currently writing, which will go out in the agenda tomorrow lunchtime for the Pension Committee. And that report to the Pension Committee will set out in some detail and in a structured manner the issues relating to the subject, which will allow the Pension Committee and indeed the board to take an informed view. Convener, if it would be helpful, for this meeting, for me at some point to give at least some flavour of what will be in that report, I'm happy to so do, but I'll leave that option in your hands. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. If members are content, perhaps it would be helpful to have a flavour of what would be contained within that report before there's a final decision taken. Colleagues?
I would agree.
Yeah.
I would like more detail. That's the whole point of this debate, for me anyway.
Okay, Brian, you happy to give us an overview of the report?
Yes, convener, indeed. And maybe also just to say, to help inform the deliberations of Pension Committee and Board a week on Thursday, the intention is to have one of the investment portfolio managers from the Lothian fund, from their in-house team, who is a specialist in this area, to give a short presentation on some of the practicalities, which will act as a supplement or overview to the paper. So in terms of the structure of the paper, there'll be some contextual aspects which I think are helpful, and I'll just mention some of them. It's already been noted that it's not just the Falkirk Pension Fund, it is actually over 30 other employers in the fund. So it's not appropriate to view this as just our fund. It's a shared fund with a number of other big employers, most notably, but not restricted to the other two councils in the area. There is about 80 million in benefits we pay each year and that's and there's a strong linkage with employers' contributions. So any decisions that are going to make, in effect, the fund more expensive will flush through to employer contributions, and I think every employer in the fund is under pressure. It's also helpful to note that in practice there's two strands here. There's the direct investment that we hold in companies where we do have the wherewithal readily, were a decision to be taken, to divest. But we also have holdings in index investments whereby basically you buy an index, the FTSE 100, for example, and inherent in that there will be fossil fuel companies, which is a complication in any consideration of divestment. So just those two strands, and just in sense of scale, it jumps day to day. The last time I looked, it was about 35 million. I've just had an update today. It's 50 million in direct fossil fuel investments. So that's 50 million. It's a big number, but it's about 1.5% of a 3 billion fund. So there is a contextual matter there. The next area, and it's a key one, is legal considerations. There is case law and legal opinion fairly recently. The last one was 2016 from Pinsent Mason, and blanket divestment from a single sector or geography in response to, for example, climate change does risk legal challenge, and that's because the purpose for which pension funds exist is to provide retirement benefits and not to further some other aim, such as climate change. So there is a clear legal opinion that to meet their fiduciary obligations, trustees, i.e. the pension committee, should make the generation of financial returns their primary focus. And also, another strand to the opinion also is clear that when a decision is taken to sell assets, to divest on non-financial grounds, such as climate change, that should be done on a case-by-case basis rather than an across-the-board basis. So that's a very important reference point in taking such decisions. There's also the question, is divestment effective in terms of what you're trying to achieve? When you divest, you cease to have any influence or vote over a company. And there are now many examples where shareholder pressure has been the catalyst to get significant change, to get companies moving to more carbon efficient business models. And there's been significant resolutions, some of which we as a fund have directly sponsored at the AGMs of, for example, BP, Shell, Rio Tinto, Barclays. And selling your share doesn't make the problem go away. There's this misconception that somehow or another you're starving the company of capital. All you're doing is selling your shares on to somebody else who may well have a less of an environmental conscience. And the big sovereign wealth funds, particularly China and the Middle East, are very active in this area, as is private capital. And you have no influence over them whatsoever. So the funding is still there. And I think that's an important thing to have regard to. And there's also a strong and developing track record of these fossil fuel companies making significant transformation to renewables. the Danish company Dong, Danish oil and natural gas company, it's now rebranded, was a major player. It now leads the renewable sector. So that's a classic example of a company that's totally transformed. Total are a big player in this transition. Repsol, Spanish energy company, is another one. There's also the point I think it's been touched on in terms of the particular dynamics relating to our own area, the Grangemouth complex, and the importance of oil there. And as has been touched on already in the context of the sterling representation, fossil fuel is only one part of the climate equation. There are many other industry sectors that are responsible. And there's, on the back of that, there's a strong argument that actually, rather than just concentrating on the supply side, the oil companies, etc., that more attention is directed to those using that supply, air transport, haulage, etc. And that's maybe a dimension to bear in mind. And I'll just wrap up with some practical examples of what this fund, our fund, is doing in this space. Very recently, the past few months, we've initiated a new mandate, 150 million mandate with a asset manager, Pictet, which is a global mandate which mainly invests in companies whose businesses are in clean energy, water, pollution control, agriculture, forestry, and other areas in the environmental value chain. So we are proactively engaging and investing in environmental friendly areas. And we've also made various investments, primarily through our infrastructure strand. We've got wind farms, solar parks, hydroelectric schemes, waste energy, Thames Tideway Tunnel, high-speed trains, carbon credits. So there's a whole area of active investment. We're also a member of several multi-fund pressure groups, and these have assets into the trillions, and are now effectively coordinating pressure on companies with regard to the Paris Accord and the challenge that flows from that. So I'll stop there, convener. That's not exhaustive, but hopefully and helpfully it gives you a sense of the complexity inherent in this, and the sense that divestment perhaps doesn't deliver quite what it's looking to achieve, and that there's other ways to the same end that arguably are more effective. But I think it's also important to remember, my final point, the fund already explicitly in its statement of investment principles has the power to divest. So that's already on the table. And I would envisage, and indeed I anticipate it's maybe one of the recommendations that will be made in this report to the Pension Committee, is that we look to give that more teeth insofar as being more proactive in tracking those companies in terms of what they're delivering in practice on this agenda, as opposed to what they say they will do, to actually more effectively hold them to account. So if they say we're going to be divesting from oil and fuel exploration, for example, and then we find their capital expenditure plans are heavily loaded, contrary to that, that's a clear signal that they're not being serious on this agenda. So I think that's a productive area where we can reinforce the stance, and where a company isn't playing ball, isn't serious about it, isn't in practice doing what it says it's going to do, then yes, I think we, in those cases, on a targeted, informed and selective basis, should divest. So I'll stop there, Convener.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Councillor Grant, have you got a question?
Yes, it's questions.
Very brief.
A couple of questions, very brief questions. They are very brief, and thanks for that, Brian. That's almost the same as you came to the administration of Falkirk Council with, the sort of the same report, the same information, and the administration made the decision to come forward with this motion on the back of all of that information. So I reiterate, we have looked into this at great depth. Brian, could you confirm, and I read it out in sort of my speaking towards the motion, that Falkirk Council Pension Fund has one of the largest proportions of its fund in the UK directly associated with fossil fuels. I know you keep saying it's a small number in the big picture of things, but it is still £50 million, which is a large number. So could you confirm that, Brian?
I'm not sure that that is the case. There's obviously a considerable number of pension funds across the local government pension funds across the UK, and to say that we're top of the list would surprise me. I think one needs to recognise that the figure to which that relates will change day to day as investment decisions are made. Within a framework, we delegate investment to our managers. In our case, we harness the investment resource of the Lothian Pension Fund for part of the investment, but other parts are allocated to external fund managers, Baillie Gifford, Schroders, and the like, and they, within the investment agreement with us, are free to invest in appropriate areas, and they'll make their specialist calls on that. But they all these companies have, as part of their investment decisions, screening considerations in terms of environmental considerations. So I can't answer your question directly. I can give you the fact that we have at today have 50 million across maybe half a dozen companies in the direct fossil fuel space, and that's about 1.5% of the fund. Whether that's the top or bottom or middle relative to all the other LGPS's funds, I can't say.
Right, okay, well, according to Divest UK, it is one of the highest, and yes, it did surprise me as well. I think it was something like 4 years ago I brought this up to you, Brian, and we discussed it at length then, and I've been at you every year since, sort of thing. Just the last quick question, and this is to Brian as well, and you're saying that there could be legal challenges, all this kind of stuff. Other councils have made this decision before us. Stirling's coming with a letter which is asking for near enough the exact same as us. So why are we a council that we can't push forward with this?
I think we are pushing forward with this in the terms that I've tried to outline in my previous comments. Both active investment in environmental areas, the 150 million mandate was a specific example of that, and a sharper tracking of fossil fuel companies with intent to divest where they're not delivering on this agenda. So we are moving forward, and most funds are adopting that strategy.
Okay, well, thank you for that, but I'm talking about fully divesting. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Garner. And can I just say that the decision isn't for the executive to make, it's a decision for the pension committee to make. But we in Falkirk Council are looking to provide a clear policy direction for the pension committee. And I'm a bit disappointed just at the lack of understanding. The pension fund would not put at risk its investments for its shareholders. And in divesting in one area, you would look to invest in other areas, and there's great potential there to look to invest in renewables, and therefore keeping the fund stabilised, but at the same time making a clear commitment to the climate emergency that's before us. Those that have been on the carbon literacy training, and this is where my real disappointment's coming in. Find that whatever actions, little or big, will make a difference. It just needs lots of us to do that, and by kicking this into the long grass, which is essentially what it's doing, and not making that commitment, then we are not locally going to be making our commitment to that climate emergency, and that is really disappointing, considering the folks that have been on the carbon literacy training with us and have made that commitment to do all that they can. And we all have a responsibility. It's not just national governments, local governments, it's all of us as individuals. That's why I think that our motion gives a clear direction to the pension fund for its consideration. It will go through its due process and will take a view on that. But I think that we can then be clear in our commitment to what it is we want to do. So I'll open it up for any other member that wishes to speak. No, in that case, we'll move. Oh, sorry, Councillor Alexander. Councillor Alexander, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Right. 2 weeks ago, at an executive meeting, Councillor Bissett stated that this was the number one issue. It should be our priority to do today, tomorrow, and the next day. All policies should be geared towards climate change. And first opportunity to cement that. Whenever there's the opportunity to be a point, it's all towards the future, towards tomorrow.
Convener, I'm sorry, but Councillor Alexander seems to be breaking up.
So good enough. The issue of
David, you're breaking up, and we're not catching what you're saying towards the end there. Apologies.
Can you hear me?
It's still kind of breaking up a wee bit. Could I suggest you put your video off and maybe see if that improves the sound?
Is that better?
If you continue to speak, we'll be able to hear.
Okay. So saying when a big decision is there to be taken, Labour are absent. When there's an opportunity to do their policies in the green corner, Labour are absent. I can only assume that's because this is an SNP motion, and no one can be seen to be supporting an SNP motion on the Labour benches. If that's the case, then there's certainly evidence that this is the case, then this authority will continue lag behind every other local authority in the country in terms of its standing, in terms of its actions. So very disappointed. But not surprised. Thank you, Kevin.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Alexander. I'm going to take Councillor Munro and then I'll move to the vote because I'm very aware that we do have a 10 o'clock meeting of the Education, Children and Young People's Executive. So Councillor Munro.
Thank you, Cecil. I think we all went through our climate change training, but Brian has actually provided us with all this additional information. It was a very compelling and thorough report, and on that basis, I think we have a very clear picture of what the situation is, and I for one would like to thank Brian for his information.
Thank you, Councillor Munro. If we can move to the vote.
Yes, thank you, Convener. We have a motion which appears on today's agenda, which is moved by Councillor Garner and seconded by Councillor Bowes, against which there is an amendment which has been circulated and displayed on the screen, which is moved by Councillor Bissett and seconded by Councillor Coombs. Councillor Alexander. Councillor Bissett.
Amendment.
Councillor Black.
Amendment.
Councillor Bowes.
Motion.
Councillor Coombs.
The amendment.
Councillor Garner.
The motion.
Councillor Harris.
Amendment.
Councillor Hughes.
For the motion.
Councillor Kerr.
Amendment.
Councillor Meiklejohn.
For the motion.
Councillor Munro.
The amendment.
And Councillor Nimmo.
Amendment.
Convener, there were 5 votes for the motion. There were 7 votes for the amendment. The amendment is carried.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Moody, and can I thank members for their attendance at this morning's special executive. We are due to now move into the Education and Children and Young People's executive. So for those that will be rejoining at that point, we'll have just a 5-10 minute break, just to allow everybody to join, and we will begin the next executive. Okay, thanks very much, folks.